Hercule Poirot and the Mirror that Reflected. Another. Chapter 1. The Mirror in the Bachelor's Gallery. The Langridge country house, known as Solstice Manor, was perfectly isolated from the bustle of London. Situated on the high cliffs of Devon, between formal gardens and mist-shrouded woodland, it seemed designed to hold secrets. It was the ideal location for what Lady Eugenia Langridge called, with a chilly smile, a week of civilized conversation between gentlemen of some distinction. It was a damp and silent October afternoon when the first of the guests arrived. Colonel Archibald Worthing, retired from the army, but still imbued with his martial aura, was escorted to the main gallery by butler Griggs. He was followed by the young artist Basil Fleet, as nervous as his still undefined moustache, and the charming Dr. Lucien Mott, whose easy smile perhaps concealed a less superficial understanding of the human mind. Lady Eugenie had gathered an exclusively male circle, under the guise of a private art auction. However, rumours were otherwise. It was said that her nephew, Anthony Langridge, had returned from Argentina not only rich, but with enemies. What's more, that the elderly lady had changed her will days before. Not all of the guests were friends. The evening passed with red wine, Egyptian cigarettes, and growing discomfort. At 11 o'clock, the crash of broken glass interrupted the conversation in the smoking room. A piercing scream, unmistakable in its despair, came from the gallery. Déticheur, men ran. When they arrived, they found Anthony Langridge collapsed on the floor, with a head wound. Beside him, the enormous full-length mirror that dominated the gallery was shattered. The splinters reflected distorted fragments of the victim's pale face. The strangest thing, however, was what they didn't see. There were no signs of a struggle, no weapon in sight. The window was locked from the inside. The only entrance, too. Lady Eugenie didn't scream. She regarded her nephew's body with a coldness that chilled the blood of those present. Then she turned to the butler and said simply, "Call Hercule Poirot." 3 days later, the famous Belgian detective arrived at Solstice Manor, impeccably dressed despite the mud on the road. He wore a light grey coat without a single wrinkle, and his walking stick gleamed as if it had never touched the ground. He was received by Lady Eugenie in the greenhouse, where he cultivated orchids with the same dedication he gave to family scandals. "Monsieur Poirot," she said without preamble, "I'm afraid the local police are too credulous. They say it was an accident, that my nephew hit his head when he tripped. But I don't believe in accidents, or in fatal stumbles in front of a broken mirror." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "A mirror, madam. It's interesting. It always reflects the truth, but it can also hide the essential." "Where is the body?" "In the basement cold room. An autopsy was performed. It was a clean hit, just behind the left ear. Very precise." Poirot frowned. "And the guests? They're still here. I decided to delay their departure, to prevent, let's say, the truth from escaping through the front door." Poirot nodded, satisfied. "Then we'll start with the small grey cells. With your permission, I'd like to see the crime scene." In the gallery, Poirot walked slowly, his eyes scanning every corner. The mirror frame still lay against the wall, empty. The floor had been cleaned, but not perfectly. A thin line of dust still remained, disturbed by footprints, only visible at a certain angle. Mademoiselle, was the mirror anchored? Firmly, replied Griggs the steward. It couldn't have fallen on its own. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Then someone knocked him over, and at that moment Monsieur Langridge died. Do you mean they used the mirror as a weapon? Poirot shook his head slightly. No, no, no. That would be too crude. The mirror is the symbol, not the instrument. He bent down, picking up a small shard of glass. This doesn't belong in the mirror. It's made of something else. Something curved. A monocle, maybe. Griggs shrugged. Poirot put the crystal in his handkerchief and turned towards the door. I must speak to all the guests in order, calmly, and if possible. He paused, looking back at the empty frame. Let no one touch the remaining fragments. Reflections, Monsieur Griggs, sometimes capture what the eyes miss. That night, as the fog thickened over the cliffs, Poirot locked himself in his room with a map of the house, the preliminary statements, and the fragment of glass. His gaze fell on an old photograph of Anthony Langridge hanging in the library. In it, Anthony was smiling. He was wearing a monocle. Poirot closed his eyes. A soft whisper escaped his lips. The mirror didn't reflect Anthony. It reflected someone else. Chapter 2. Shadows on Faces. The next morning, Hercule Poirot ate breakfast alone in the east dining room. His cup of black coffee was exactly centred on the saucer, and the rolls were cut into perfect halves as he spread the butter with mathematical precision. His gaze was absent, as if every movement were mechanical, and his mind were miles away, or rather, a few feet away, on the gallery where Anthony Langridge had died without logical explanation. Lady Eugenie entered dressed in impeccable mourning, her black veil barely veiling the challenge in her gaze. Monsieur Poirot, I'm worried by the slowness of this investigation, he said coldly. My nephew is dead, the guests are trapped, and the press is already whispering about family scandals. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Madam, if you want speed, you must consult the butcher. If you want justice, you must trust the slow cooker of truth. She didn't answer, but she didn't reply either. She knew that this ridiculously meticulous man was her best hope. At 10 o'clock sharp, Poirot summoned the guests to the music room. The space was elegant, decorated with instruments that, according to the butler Griggs, hadn't been played for decades. Even so, the atmosphere had a dense, almost theatrical harmony. Poirot stood before them like a conductor before an unscored symphony. Messieurs, I beg your patience. I'll ask questions, and I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but lies often hide in the simplest details. The first to be questioned was Colonel Archibald Worthing. Standing with his back straight and his hands behind his hips, he seemed still awaiting orders from some invisible general. Where were you the night of the incident? In the smoking room, with young Basil and Dr. Mott. Did they stay together the whole time? The colonel hesitated. Mott went out for a few minutes. He said he was going to get more cognac. Poirot nodded without taking notes. And you, Colonel, did you know Mr. Langridge well? Enough. He was an ambitious young man. He moved among shadows rather than soldiers. Shadow, you say? Metaphor, Monsieur Poirot. although in this house one begins to doubt." Poirot dismissed him with a slight bow. Basil Fleet, the artist, was next. He seemed more nervous than the night before, and his gaze could not hold the detective's. "When was the last time you saw Anthony Langridge alive?" "A few minutes before the scream. I was admiring the mirror. I mean, the frame. I'm fascinated by antique frames." "And what did you see at that moment?" "Nothing strange. Just my reflection. Although—" She hesitated. "I think I saw Anthony walk down the hall behind me." "And you followed him?" "No. I had a glass in my hand and I was looking at a sketch in my notebook." Poirot smiled softly. Artists see what others don't. Sometimes even what doesn't exist. Then it was Dr. Mott's turn. He sat, relaxed, crossing his legs as if he were in his office. "Poirot, I'll tell you what I would tell any country policeman. It was an unfortunate fall. The angle of the impact indicates a loss of balance. Did you perform the autopsy?" "No, but I attended. My opinion is medical, and also logical, and psychologically. I wouldn't dare compete with you, Monsieur Poirot. But I know men like I know my scalpels. If you push them, they bleed." Poirot leaned back slightly in his chair. "And who pushed Anthony Langridge, metaphorically speaking?" The doctor smiled with an ambiguous expression. "Maybe everyone. He was rich, arrogant, and made promises he wasn't going to keep. In this house, many have reasons to want him dead." Poirot didn't reply. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he asked to see Anthony's room. It was a sober, unpretentious room. However, Poirot walked to the desk, lifted the lid of a cigar box, and took out a ring. Gold, with a blue stone. It didn't fit the deceased's style. "Griggs," he called softly, "do you recognize this?" The butler frowned. "No, sir, but I can assure you it's not from Mr. Langridge's collection." Poirot turned it over between his fingers, then slipped it into the handkerchief where he kept the shard of glass. A ring that doesn't belong. A falling mirror. A death that makes no sense. In the window, his reflection seemed to watch him from another world. Sometimes the killer doesn't come in. He was just already there. Chapter 3. The Lie in the Portrait. Hercule Poirot walked slowly down the main corridor of Solstice Manor, his shoes clicking softly on the polished marble floor. He held the ring he'd found in the cigar box, observing it in the shifting morning light. It wasn't a mere ornament, it was a symbol of belonging, or perhaps of betrayal. Upon reaching the library, Poirot paused in front of the portrait of Anthony Langridge, the same one he had seen the previous evening. In it, the young heir posed with an expression of excessive confidence, almost defiance, one hand resting on the back of a red velvet armchair. "Mysterious," Poirot murmured. "A picture claims to capture a man's soul, and yet sometimes it reveals more about the person who painted it." Behind him, Arthur Griggs's footsteps approached with the precision of a metronome. "Do you want anything else, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, Monsieur Griggs. Tell me, who painted this portrait?" "It was Basil Fleet. Mr. Langridge ordered it upon his return from Buenos Aires about 3 months ago. They were on good terms by—" Then Poirot turned slowly on his heels, crossing his hands over his abdomen. "And now?" Griggs hesitated. Mr. Fleet seemed annoyed lately. He was complaining quietly that his work wouldn't be paid, and he mentioned that Antony was accusing him of falsifying certain sketches. Poirot nodded, as if confirming a mathematical formula. "Thank you, Griggs. That's all for now." Young Basil Fleet stood in the greenhouse, surrounded by exotic plants that seemed more at ease than he was. Seeing Poirot approach, his nervousness translated into sudden movements. He almost knocked over a vase. "Monsieur Poirot, I have nothing to hide, I swear." "Ah, monsieur, innocent people are the ones who swear the most. I only wished to talk about art." Basil swallowed. Poirot showed him the ring. "Do you recognize him?" No, I've never seen it before." Poirot didn't insist. Instead, he took a magnifying glass from his pocket and held it up to the printout of Anthony Langridge he had brought with him. His finger pointed to a specific spot, the sitter's hand. On the ring finger, discreetly, was an identical ring. Funny, isn't it? In real life, she didn't wear this. But in the portrait, she did. Why? Basil hesitated. "Antony asked me to add it. He said it was a symbol, that the ring had a story. He never explained what it was." Poirot watched him in silence. "And you? Did you know who it belonged to?" "No, I just drew it." Poirot looked at him for a moment longer. Then he spoke in a neutral tone. "A painting can lie, but it always reveals its author's intention." Shortly after, Poirot requested a private meeting with Lady Eugénie. He found her in her private drawing-room, leafing through a leather-bound family memoir. The air smelled of lavender and frozen time. "Madam, do you remember this ring?" She took it elegantly, examined it without surprise, and handed it back without hesitation. "It belonged to Lionel Ashcombe, my first husband. He died over 30 years ago." Poirot frowned. "And how did it end up in your nephew's cigar box? Anthony used to snoop through old trunks. He had an unhealthy habit of revisiting the past as if it belonged to him. Did you have affection for Lionel?" "No, he despised him. He said he was a weak man, manipulated by this family. But he also said his ring opened doors. I assumed he was speaking figuratively." Poirot paused. His tone changed subtly. "Are there doors in this house that shouldn't be opened?" Lady Eugenia closed the book with a loud bang. "In this house, Monsieur Poirot, everyone keeps keys. What they do with them depends on how afraid they are of what's behind the lock." Later, in his room, Poirot arranged the objects he had collected so far on a table. The fragment of glass that hadn't belonged to the mirror, Lionel Ashcombe's ring, and a printed copy of the portrait. He sat cross-legged, his fingers clasped in front of his face. The pieces didn't fit together yet. And yet, a melody was beginning to emerge beneath the cacophony. There was something curious about the reflections. They lied depending on the observer's position. What one saw in the mirror wasn't the same as what others saw from the side. And then an image emerged clearly. The monocle in the photo, the broken mirror, the ring in the painting, not on the body. The scene was theatrical, yes, but not improvised, Poirot murmured. If the portrait lies, then death was foretold, and perhaps it wasn't a crime of rage, but a dress rehearsal. Chapter 4. The second reflection. That night the fog enveloped us again. Solstice Manor-like a sheet of secrets. From his window, Poirot watched the trees disappear into moving shadows, as if nature itself refused to offer witnesses. He closed the curtain with a precise gesture and went to the desk. He lit an oil lamp that cast a soft light. On the ring, the glass fragment and the copy of the portrait lined up like pieces on a chessboard. The portrait, a carefully painted falsehood. A ring with no owner present. A reflection that was not Anthony Langridge's. There was something else there, something still beyond his understanding. And so, the next day, Poirot asked Griggs to take him to the North Wing, where the rest of the art furniture and rejected works from the Langridge collection were stored. "Ah, monsieur," said Griggs as he opened the door to a quiet, damp room. "These are the objects that Mr. Anthony considered too sentimental to be displayed." Poirot walked among statues covered with sheets and upturned canvases. His gaze fell on a smaller antique mirror with an oval frame and a diagonal crack like a badly healed scar. He pointed at it. Was this part of the gallery? "Yes, sir. It was withdrawn a few months ago. Mr. Langridge said it didn't reflect what it should." Personally, I never understood that phrase. Poirot leaned toward the glass. His reflection was distorted by the crack, as if his own face were wearing a twisted grimace. He touched the frame gently. And who moved it? Young Basil, as I recall. He was the one who helped hang the new mirror. Poirot slowly straightened up. A sparkle danced in his eyes. "Thank you, Griggs. That was all I needed." Hours later, Poirot met with Dr. Mott again. This time the tone was more informal. They walked through the garden, a white gravel path that crunched underfoot. "Doctor, you said that Monsieur Langridge's head wound was precise. What kind of blow causes something like that without leaving a trace of the weapon?" Mott stroked his chin thoughtfully. "A hard, cylindrical object, metal or glass. Not very heavy, but directed with force, like a cane, or even a monocle, perhaps." The doctor raised his eyebrows. "Unlikely, but not impossible. One with a heavy mount, perhaps. Why do you ask?" Poirot did not answer directly. "Did you know Lionel Ashcombe?" "Just because of the family history." "Why are you mentioning it now?" "Because the ring found in the cigar box belonged to him, and Anthony's portrait shows him wearing it, even though he never used it. It's as if someone wanted to insert a symbol into the narrative of his death." Mott looked at the horizon, meditating. "Do you think this was a set-up?" Poirot stopped. "My friend, this was a play. Rehearsed, framed. And someone chose a mirror as the stage." That evening, Poirot summoned everyone present to the library. Lady Eugenie, impassive in her armchair. Basil Fleet, pale and holding a notebook under his arm. Colonel Worthing, his expression hardened. Dr. Mott, curious but alert. And Griggs, standing like a piece of furniture, though his eyes were fixed on Poirot. "My friends," Poirot began, "Anthony Langridge's death was no accident, nor was it impulsive. It was a symbolic execution." Murmurs began, but Poirot raised a hand. The gallery mirror didn't fall by chance. It had been replaced weeks before. Why? Because the killer needed a specific reflection, one that didn't show the victim, but rather himself, unwittingly. What do you mean? Lady Eugenie asked tensely. That the killer was seen, reflected, in an unplanned act. Maybe Anthony noticed, maybe he threatened to speak, and then someone acted. Poirot turned to Basil. Monsieur Fleet, you painted a ring that didn't exist. Why? The young man swallowed. Anthony asked me to. He said he wanted to include it as a symbol of power. He swore he'd pay me if I did. Poirot approached. Did you know that ring belonged to Lionel Ashcombe? No, I had no idea. Poirot looked at everyone, and yet that ring appeared at the crime scene, a detail that was meant to remain hidden, and now it burns like a torch in the darkness. There was a thick silence. Poirot let it settle. Then, in a deep voice, he concluded, Someone here knew more about that ring, and also more about what happened in front of the mirror. His eyes scanned the tense faces one by one. Then he turned elegantly and said, The truth is very close. Tomorrow, we will reveal it. Chapter 5. The Game of Closed Doors. The next morning, the tension in Solstice Manoret was as palpable as the dampness trapped between its ancient walls. Breakfast was served in complete silence. No one touched the bitter orange roll, and the coffee grew cold in untouched cups. The suspects no longer seemed like elegant guests, but rather captive pieces on a board they didn't fully understand. Only Poirot moved with absolute calm, cutting his boiled egg with almost surgical precision. When the clock struck 11, he asked Griggs to accompany him to inspect the entrances to the house. I want to test a hypothesis, Monsieur Griggs. Something about movement in this house, about doors that open, and those that don't. The butler guided him with British professionalism. The house, with its winding corridors, slowly revealed its secrets. Some doors creaked, others were locked, but one in particular caught Poirot's attention, a narrow door hidden between the main gallery and the music room. Does this lead to a service staircase, sir? Very few people use it. It's meant for staff. And was it closed the night of the crime? Griggs frowned. I don't know for sure. He could have been, or not. Poirot bent down, examined the lock and the handle, then raised his face. This door allows someone to enter the gallery without being seen from the main corridor, or to leave. Yeah, I guess so, Griggs replied uncomfortably. Poirot nodded slowly. A house with secrets requires doors with memories, and this one has a lot to remember. Shortly after, Poirot requested another meeting with the guests. This time, not in the library, but in the very gallery where Anthony Langridge died. The splinters of the broken mirror were still there, enclosed behind a red velvet rope that Poirot had requested not to be moved. When everyone was present, Poirot spoke. Today I want us to listen, not to what lips say, but to what actions deny. Let's start with a simple question. Who knew Anthony Langridge was using the portrait to send a message? Message? Basil repeated, confused. Yes, monsieur, because that's what the portrait was. A visual manifesto. The ring, the monocle, the posture, all elements carefully placed to represent something. But what? Poirot turned to Dr. Mott. Doctor, you've dealt with complex minds. Tell me, what would be the purpose of inserting secret symbols into a portrait? Mott interlaced his fingers. Power or warning, maybe a veiled confession. Poirot smiled softly. Exactly. Anthony Langridge wasn't a sentimental man, but he was calculating. I suspect he was onto something that compelled him to leave a message, not out of fear of dying, but because he was being watched. Everyone fell silent. Poirot continued, and he discovered it here, in this gallery. Maybe not the crime, but the criminal, because he saw a reflection, not his own, but someone else's. The mirror, remember, was positioned so that it captured the side corridor. From there, you could see anyone entering through the service door, Lady Eugenie, who until then had maintained an immutable posture, spoke coldly. "Are you suggesting that my house condones crime, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, madame. I'm saying your house covered it up, but unintentionally. Houses don't lie. Only those who live in them." Poirot turned slowly, his hands clasped on his stomach. "And that's why today we're going to reconstruct what happened, one by one, in exact order, because the truth is already here." First came Colonel Worthing. He walked from the smoking room to the gallery, stopping at the spot where the brandy glass had been. Poirot watched him silently, mentally marking the angles. Then Basil repeated the journey he had described, from the dining room to the gallery, passing in front of the mirror. "Stop," said Poirot. "Do you see that spot there? In the crack in the frame there was a linen fibre, one that matches your jacket." Basil paled. "I didn't push Anthony, I swear. I just happened to be passing by. I heard a noise, and the mirror fell. Before or after Anthony fell?" Basil didn't know how to answer. Poirot left him there, staring at his own broken reflection. Finally, he called Griggs. The butler hesitated, but walked to the same spot as Basil. Poirot pointed out a fragment of glass with partial fingerprints. "These prints are fresh, only visible with starch dust, and they're not Anthony's. They're yours, Monsieur Griggs." The butler's face twisted. I found the mirror crooked a week ago. I pushed it to centre it. I didn't say anything. It didn't seem important." Poirot watched him for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to face everyone. "It's interesting, when you lie to protect yourself from something small, without knowing that this small lie connects you to something immense." He let the silence weigh like a tombstone. Then he said in a low but firm voice, "Tomorrow night the truth will come out, and this house will have nowhere to hide." Chapter 6. The Words That Were Not Said. Night fell upon Solstice Manor, with a silence deeper than usual. Not an owl sang. From the woods, not a branch rustled in the wind. It was as if nature itself had stopped to wait. Poirot remained in his room, standing in front of the almost extinguished fire, his hands clasped behind his back. On the small table beside him, the objects from the case were still arranged with the same geometric rigour. Lionel Ashcombe's ring, the curved glass fragment, the copy of the portrait, a blank sheet of paper, and a recently discovered antique key. That key wasn't in the opening scene. I'd found it hours earlier, hidden inside Anthony Langridge's decorative walking stick, forgotten behind the gallery closet. A tiny, unlabelled wrought-iron key. "A key without a lock," Poirot murmured. "Or perhaps a lock without a master." He put it in his pocket just as someone knocked on the door. "Go ahead," he said. It was Colonel Worthing. He entered stiffly, but his eyes showed a certain unease. "Monsieur Poirot, could I speak to you for a moment?" Poirot invited him to. "Sit down." The Colonel remained standing. "I haven't been entirely honest. The night of the crime, I went out into the garden for a moment. I had a letter from Anthony." "A letter?" "Yes. He called me in for a private conversation. He said he knew something about my years abroad, something that could damage my reputation if I didn't cooperate with a certain business." I felt outraged. What did he do then? I refused to go. I burned the letter. I thought it was just another blackmail attempt. I didn't see him at all that night, until I heard the scream. Poirot watched him closely. And did that letter contain specific details? Just hints, but enough to make me uneasy. Believe me, if I'd seen him that night, I would have had some harsh words. But I didn't touch him, I swear. Poirot nodded slightly. "Thank you for your frankness, Colonel. Although late, it may still be useful." The Colonel left silently. Poirot was left alone again, reflecting. Anthony Langridge, it seemed, didn't just weave symbols into portraits. He also wove veiled threats, pulled invisible strings. But a blackmailer doesn't threaten those he doesn't fear. And Anthony seemed to fear no one, except, perhaps, his own family. At dawn, Poirot walked back down the corridor that connected the gallery to the library. This time, he had the small key with him. He stopped in front of a painting on the wall, a dark, unsigned picture depicting a seemingly unprepossessing bucolic scene. "Griggs," he called, "could you tell me what's behind this panel?" The butler looked at him in bewilderment. "It's just a wall, monsieur." Poirot smiled politely. "Come with me, then." With the help of a small tool, Poirot removed the frame. Behind it, a small crack revealed a recessed metal box with a lock that perfectly matched the key he had found. "Voilà," said Poirot as he opened it. Inside were several neatly folded papers and an old black-and-white photograph. It showed Lionel Ashcombe standing next to a young man who, upon closer inspection, was none other than Anthony, much younger than he should have been at the time. Griggs paled. That doesn't make sense." Poirot took one of the documents. It was a birth certificate. "But he does, Mr. Griggs, because this document says that Anthony Langridge was not the son of the late Mr. Roland Langridge, as everyone believed, but of Lionel Ashcombe himself." Griggs leaned against the wall. My God! A buried truth, a hidden heir, a mirror that reflected not only a face, but an unrecognized bloodline. Shortly after, Poirot gathered everyone in the music room. The fire sparkled as the suspects, one by one, entered with anxious expressions. This time, Poirot didn't walk among them. He sat like an invisible judge and spoke. "I've discovered what Anthony Langridge was trying to hide and reveal at the same time. His death wasn't an act of impulse or anger. It was a crime designed to protect a lie too big to survive the light of day." Everyone looked at him tensely. Poirot held up the birth certificate. Anthony was an Ashcombe, not a Langridge. His existence as a legitimate heir jeopardized the position of other family members. And if he decided to claim what was rightfully his... Lady Eugenia narrowed her eyes. So someone had a reason to silence him. Not someone, Poirot corrected. At least two people. One who feared losing everything, and another who knew the truth and allowed himself to be corrupted. His eyes fixed on Dr. Mott, then on Griggs. I don't have the final proof yet, but tomorrow we'll have it, and then no one will be able to hide behind broken mirrors anymore. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Blood. The news of Anthony Langridge's true parentage had left Solstice manna-plunged into a silent unease. No one spoke about it openly, but faces spoke louder than words. Lady Eugenie didn't come down for breakfast. Basil Fleet shut himself in the library with his notebook, as if he could elude the truth between charcoal lines. Colonel Worthing paced around the greenhouse, pretending to gaze at the orchids while clenching his fists behind his back. And Griggs avoided glances. Only Poirot seemed unaffected, with his perfectly brushed grey suit and his moustache even more polished than usual. At 11 o'clock, Poirot again requested access to the Langridge family archives, which Lady Eugenie kept locked in the main. Study. The elderly matriarch granted it without speaking, with a single look that contained years of control, and perhaps for the first time a hint of fear. The room was panelled in dark wood, and the oak desk resembled a shrine to family memory. Poirot, meticulous as ever, sifted through documents with gloves. Ownership certificates, old letters, photograph albums. Finally, he found what he was looking for. A yellowed letter, dated 1897, signed by Lionel Ashcombe. It was brief. To my unrecognized son, I leave the key to his future. A mirror can hide the truth only until someone dares to look from the other side. Poirot closed the letter delicately. A mirror, he murmured. Always the mirror. Not as an object, but as a symbol, as a warning. As he left the studio, Poirot ran into Basil Fleet. The young artist had a haggard face, dishevelled hair, and the expression of someone burdened by more than remorse. "Monsieur Poirot, may I speak to you, please?" They went into the small drawing-room. Basil sat down, but Poirot remained standing. "I knew something," Basil began. "Not about the crime, but about Anthony. Weeks ago, he asked me to alter the portrait. He said it was evidence, a way to leave, a clue for anyone who knew how to look." "What clue?" "The ring, the pose, and the background. If you look closely, there's a blurry figure behind him. It's the reflection of a second man, his back turned, almost imperceptible. Anthony told me, if anything happens to me, look who's behind me." Poirot tensed slightly. "And you did it, not until yesterday. I printed a high-resolution copy. It's the butler. It's Griggs." Poirot didn't seem surprised. He just nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Fleet. That confirms what I already suspected." "He killed him?" Poirot raised a hand. "I'll tell you this, monsieur. Griggs did not act alone." That evening, Poirot gathered everyone together for the last time before the final revelation. He chose the partially restored gallery, with the mirror's empty frame still hanging like an open wound on the wall. He positioned himself next to the pedestal where the mirror had once lain, while the others had sat in a semicircle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a calm voice, "this house has hidden secrets for decades, but like any misaligned mirror, The cracks eventually reveal what no one wants to look at. He turned to Lady Eugenia. "Madam, you knew that Anthony was not the legitimate son of your second husband, did you not?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "I knew it from the beginning. Lionel confessed it to me before he died. I wanted to hide it for the sake of the family name. And you were afraid that Anthony would claim what was his? I was afraid he'd destroy everything I protected. I raised him as a Langridge, and he betrayed me." Poirot nodded without harshness. "And Griggs was his accomplice." The butler stepped forward, but said nothing. Poirot continued. "You saw Anthony that night. You knew he was going to confront Lady Eugenie with the letter and the portrait. But someone else knew it too. Someone who had been part of the past and didn't want it to come to light." Poirot took out the old photograph. "Dr. Mott, would you like to tell us why you appear in this image taken in 1899? The doctor paled. That's not possible. It must be a mistake." "Sure, isn't. You were very young then. But you were Lionel Ashcombe's illegitimate son too, weren't you?" Absolute silence. Poirot continued. He didn't want it to be known that Anthony wasn't the only one, that another, even more hidden heir existed. So when he learned that Anthony had discovered the secret files, he decided to act. Mott swallowed. "I didn't kill him, but you pushed him. Not violently, but cunningly. You summoned him. You showed him the portrait. You confronted him. And when Anthony turned around, you struck him with your reinforced monocle, designed as an optical instrument, but also as a weapon. Then you let the mirror fall on your body to simulate an accident. Griggs helped cover the tracks, out of loyalty or fear." Griggs barely murmured. "I didn't know you were going to kill him. I just wanted to help Lady Eugenia." Poirot nodded one last time. The mirror didn't just reflect a crime. It reflected a truth none of you wanted to accept, that inherited lies are more dangerous than committed ones. That night, the police took Dr. Mott away. Griggs was held as a passive accomplice. Lady Eugenie didn't say a word. She simply returned to her greenhouse and remained there among the mute orchids until well into the early hours. Poirot, leaving with his suitcase and walking stick, looked one last time at the empty frame of the mirror. "It's never the reflection that kills," he murmured. "It's the fear of what it reveals." Chapter 8. The Voice That No One Heard. The silence in Solstice Manoret was now of a different kind. It was no longer the tension of a hidden secret, but the stillness that follows a confession. Dr. Mott had been arrested, his figure dragged through echoes of suppressed indignation and murmurs that dared not rise to accusation. Griggs, the butler, was escorted from the house under the guard of the local police, whose early arrival at dawn had cut through the mist like a knife through butter. Lady Eugenie did not dismiss them. She simply did not appear. Poirot, on the other hand, didn't leave immediately. Something, a feeling too subtle to explain logically, held him back. He paced the corridors like a doctor examining a patient who had just undergone surgery, making sure there was no hidden bleeding, and it was precisely in the main hall that he stopped again, his eyes fixed on a photograph hanging awkwardly on a mantelpiece. A dusty family portrait showing Anthony Langridge as a teenager, holding an open book. Poirot approached and carefully removed it. Behind it, as if the house were finally speaking to him, he found something unexpected. A gap in the wall, and inside it an old-fashioned tape recorder, one of those cylinder ones, with a small on-off button still stained with ink. Poirot closed the hall door and examined the machine with the delicacy of a goldsmith. As he turned the handle on the side and pressed the button, a faint whirring noise came to life, followed by a creak, and then a voice. "If you're listening to this, I'm probably already dead," said Anthony Langridge's voice in a dry tone without a trace of fear. "I can't trust anyone. Mott knows. I don't know how he found out, but he knows. He showed me the ring. He told me we share blood, that my mother knew all along, that I'm a mistake that needs fixing. He said he wouldn't do it himself, that he'd make it look like an accident. I recorded it because I want someone, at least one, to know I didn't fall. I was made to fall." The sound cut off abruptly. Poirot stood motionless for several seconds, as if even his grey matter fell silent in a sign of respect. Then he took a deep breath, turned off the recorder, and put it back in its place. He wouldn't hand it over just yet. Not to hide justice, but because something still didn't quite add up. Hours later, Poirot appeared before Lady Eugénie. She was sitting in the greenhouse, as always, but this time without gloves, her hands on, her knees, her nails carefully filed on one of them. "It's been a long morning, Monsieur Poirot," she said without looking at him. "And it's not over yet, madame," he replied calmly. "I heard your nephew's voice, recorded, a voice that confirms what you denied until the very end." Lady Eugenia was unfazed. "And what do you want me to say? That I knew? Yes, I knew, and I didn't stop him, but I didn't kill him. But he didn't lift a finger to stop it. I saw it in Mott's eyes, that day in the gallery, the way he looked at him, like looking into a mirror that shows what you were before you hated yourself. Anthony was like him, arrogant, ambitious, capable of destroying what gave him birth. And me, I was just the soil where the wrong seed was buried." Poirot watched the lilies behind her, in bloom. "Curious, madame. Orchids don't bloom without care, and yet you say you let the chaos grow without intervening." Lady Eugénie finally looked at him. Her eyes, still fierce, were tearless. "I intervened, Monsieur Poirot. But too late. I didn't wish for his death, only his silence." Mott took that to the extreme. Poirot stood up gently. "What's left unsaid, madam, weighs more than what's shouted. Houses like this aren't built with stone, but with omissions." At dusk, Poirot spoke to Basil Fleet for the last time. He found him gathering his things. His notebook, still full of sketches, was sticking out of his briefcase. "Is he going, Mr. Fleet?" "I have nothing left here, Monsieur Poirot. The painting I made. Now it seems like a tomb to me. One I myself helped to build without knowing it. Not all portraits are of bodies, monsieur. Some are of truth, and yours helped reveal it." Basil sighed. "And what will you do with the recording?" Poirot smiled barely. "I'll hand it over, but not yet. First, I want to know if anyone else will listen to it of their own free will. Do you think anyone else was involved? I believe it. Not directly in the crime, but in its design. Anthony knew too much, and you don't write a voice testament for just one enemy. Poirot looked out the window toward the horizon. The fog was lifting again, but this time it seemed less dense. The voice that no one heard will now be heard by all. Chapter 9. The Last Guest. The next day dawned with unusual clarity over Solstice Manor. The fog, for the first time in almost a week, had completely dissipated. The light fell unhindered on the window panes, as if the sky itself demanded transparency. For Hercule Poirot, this wasn't a divine sign, but a symptom. Secrets, when they lose their shadow, are ready to be unearthed. The police had confirmed that Dr. Mott would be prosecuted for premeditated murder with sufficient physical evidence. The modified monocle, the partial fingerprints on the base of the mirror, and now the voice recording. Griggs, as a minor accomplice, would receive his own, probably lenient, fate. Lady Eugenie wasn't charged, but she wasn't exonerated either. There were too many omissions in her role to avoid moral taint, and yet Poirot did not seem satisfied. There was a restlessness that kept him moving. Mid-morning, he returned to the library, and after a brief conversation with Basil Fleet, asked to inspect the original portrait of Anthony, not the reproduction. Basil led him to a small adjoining room he had used as a makeshift study during his stay. "Here it is, monsieur," she said, removing a linen cloth. "I haven't wanted to see it since everything happened." Poirot contemplated him in silence. Anthony Langridge was posed on his symbolic throne, with the ring, the book, his hand on the arm of the chair. And behind him, almost imperceptible, the silhouette Basil had revealed, Griggs. "Are you sure it was Griggs?" asked Poirot. Basil hesitated. He moved closer, adjusted the lamp, and between the light and the angle, the silhouette became clearer. It wasn't Griggs, it was Colonel Worthing. Poirot said nothing. He stepped back, clasped his hands and closed his eyes for a few seconds. "Thank you, Mr. Fleet." That was all. Minutes later, Poirot found Colonel Worthing in the garden. The soldier, as every morning, was pretending to look at the lilies, although this time without the composure of previous days. His moustache was less stiff. His back was slightly hunched. "Colonel," Poirot greeted, "I'd like to speak to you one last time, if you'll allow me." "About what exactly?" "About the night of the crime, and about the letter he said he destroyed." The colonel looked at him sideways. "Don't you take my word for it. I think he was telling the truth. Halfway. That he received a letter, yes, but it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The colonel did not respond. Anthony wasn't looking to blackmail you. He was looking to ally himself with you. He was offering you information in exchange for protection. He knew Mott was up to something. And you, Colonel, were the only one with military experience, and the only one who knew the secret passages in this house. Worthing clenched his jaw. "What are you implying, Poirot? That you didn't kill him. But you knew someone would, and you did nothing to stop it." The colonel remained silent for a long time. "I saw Mott coming up the back stairs. Gloves on. I made a fist and turned toward the window. I didn't hear the bang, just the scream." Poirot nodded. "And why did he remain silent?" "Because I sent him to that room." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Did you send it?" I told Anthony Mott wanted to talk, that he should wait for him there. I thought it would just be a tense exchange. I didn't imagine. But he made it easier, Poirot added, because Anthony knew something else, something about you. Worthing nodded slowly. I knew I was also Lionel Ashcombe's illegitimate son. Just another one. A chain of unwanted but useful children. He found us, one by one. I knew everything. He even said he wanted to write it down, publish it. The Ashcombe inheritance, the bastard legacy. It was the title, and that scared him. I was ashamed, but I didn't hate him. I just didn't want to save him. Poirot was silent for a few moments. Omission, Colonel, is the most elegant of cowardice. You were the last guest at the crime. You didn't commit it, but you were part of the toast. Worthing looked down. Will you tell all this to the police? I'll tell the truth, but I'll let them decide the degree of their responsibility. You already bear the worst punishment, knowing you're a witness and not a protector. That evening, Poirot prepared for his departure. He said goodbye to Basil politely, to Lady Eugénie with a bow, and to Colonel Worthing with a long drawn-out look. As he climbed into the carriage that would take him to the train, he took one last look at Solstice Manor. It no longer looked like a palace of secrets, but rather like a house in internal ruins. The evening light made it appear smaller, less imposing, more human. Inside his briefcase, Poirot kept the original portrait of Anthony Langridge, the face of a man who saw too much, he murmured, and left it all framed. Chapter 10. The Inheritance of a Silence. The train wound through the misty Devon fields, slowly moving away from Solstice Manor inside the first-class private compartment. Hercule Poirot sat with his hands folded on his cane, his face serene, but his eyes still burning with an inner restlessness. He didn't look out the window. He gazed inward, where the pieces of the mystery still revolved, not for lack of a solution, but because of the moral echo of what had been resolved. On the small table in front of him lay a single object, the original portrait of Anthony Langridge, now delicately rolled up. Beside it, the already played recording, Lionel Ashcombe's ring, and the letter found behind the hidden panel. Inert objects, yes, but laden with memory, with warning of a crime that had been more than a murder, a reckoning with the past. Poirot muttered to himself, "The little grey cells, they can solve the who and the how, but the why always leaves a bitter taste." 3 days later, in London, Poirot submitted his final report to the police. It outlined the precise chronology of events, the discovery of Anthony's lineage, the manipulation of the portrait as coded testimony, Griggs's involvement as an accessory, and Mott's primary culpability as the perpetrator. He also added an addendum, Colonel Worthing's implicit confession, and Lady Eugénie's intentional silence. The inspectors read it with scepticism at first, but upon hearing the recording, upon observing the physical evidence, they had no doubt. Charges would be issued, reports would be written, and Solstice Manor would be stained in official records as well as in family memory. And yet, Poirot did not feel victorious. That afternoon he received a letter. There was no return address, but the handwriting was firm, elegant, almost military. The contents were brief. Don't seek more justice than your conscience can handle, Monsieur Poirot. You have done your duty. With our history. It wasn't signed, but the scent of the envelope had a faint hint of orchids. Poirot closed his eyes. He needed nothing more. Days later, Poirot visited a discreet gallery in Bloomsbury. There, he handed the portrait over to a trusted curator. "Do you wish to sell it, Monsieur Poirot?" the man asked, admiring Basil Fleet's work. "No, I wish it to be preserved, to be kept as a testimony, not of a death, but of a warning, a painted mirror of what we are when we let silence have more power than the truth." The curator, confused but respectful, promised to take care of him. Poirot walked back to his apartment. The rain fell softly on the London cobblestones, and his steps, though slow, were firm. That evening, sitting in his armchair by the fire, Poirot wrote a brief reflection in his personal diary. The truth isn't always cleansing. Sometimes it reveals. And what it reveals doesn't demand justice. It demands memory. The mirror that reflected another was not an object. It was the consciousness of all who looked and did not speak. The crime was committed by one man, but allowed by several. Guilty? Yes. Murderers? Not all of them, but everyone, absolutely everyone, complicit in the silence. He closed his notebook, grabbed his cup of hot chocolate, and allowed himself a break, not out of tiredness, but out of respect. Poirot's mind never rested when he solved a crime, only when I understood it. Epilogue. The echo of things unsaid. A month had passed since the events in Solstice Manor, but in Hercule Poirot's mind, the case remained alive like a painting you can't stop looking at, because you know it hides a detail not yet fully understood. It wasn't dissatisfaction. The resolution had been logical, rigorous, complete, but a more ethereal sensation, as if something, a tiny shred of truth, had been trapped just out of reach. One grey evening, Poirot received an unexpected visitor. Basil Fleet, his coat threadbare and his gaze as steady as ever, turned up without an appointment. "Monsieur Poirot, I've come about something I haven't been able to forget." Poirot showed him into his drawing-room. The fire was lit, and a cup of hot chocolate was already steaming, as if sensing the need for comfort. Basil turned it away with a weak smile. "I didn't come out of courtesy. I came because something doesn't fit." Poirot watched him closely. "The portrait?" Basil nodded. "Yes." I looked at my work again, not as an artist, but as a witness, and I realized that something in the scene wasn't painted by me. Poirot frowned. "What do you mean?" Basil pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photograph of the portrait taken before submitting it to the gallery. He pointed to a shadow in the background. "This figure, this silhouette behind Anthony. I didn't put it there. Someone added it, afterward. And it wasn't Griggs, not Worthing, not Mott." Poirot took the picture. He stared closely at the blurred, almost imperceptible figure at the edge of the frame. "So," he said in a low voice, "there is a fourth." "Exactly," Basil confirmed. "A fourth observer, who didn't act, who didn't stop, who didn't speak." Poirot stood up slowly. He walked to his desk, where the case diary was locked. He opened it. He scanned the chronology. the letters, the confessions, the recording, the objects. Then he looked up, and for a moment he looked older than usual. "I failed," he said softly, "as I've let crime guide me, but not art. You, Monsieur Fleet, painted more than a picture. You painted a scene from the soul, and I didn't see it all." Basil leaned forward. "Who else was in that house, Poirot?" A silence. Then, very slowly, Poirot said, "There was one more guest, not on the list, not in the records, but he was there. He was mentioned once, in a torn letter. A visit Anthony had been looking forward to with trepidation. A cousin from the south, exiled in shame." Basil opened his eyes. And I never questioned him, because he never showed up. But maybe he did, under a different name, a different face, maybe even as a servant. Poirot turned the portrait around. In the lower right corner, almost imperceptible, was a signature in crooked letters. It wasn't Basil Fleet's, it was someone else's, a pseudonym. L. Poirot paled. Lionel Ashcombe didn't die just leaving children. He also left a debt of revenge, a forgotten seed that germinated unnoticed, and that was there, watching. A few days later, Poirot discreetly returned to Devon. He visited Solstice Manor, now closed, in the process of being sold. With the help of the estate's new guard, he gained access to the servants' wing. In a dusty room, he found a small diary hidden under the floorboards. Signed Louis Ainsworth, it narrated jealousy, abandonment, and a promise. "If Anthony inherits everything, I'll pay with his reflection. No one will see me, but everyone will see what he hides. I'll be the mirror they don't forget." Poirot closed the notebook with slow hands. He leaned against the wall. The real killer wasn't Mott. Not directly. It was someone else who manipulated from the shadows, using Mott as a pawn, and setting the scene to make it seem like the case was solved. Everything, except the painting. That evening, back in London, Poirot returned to his armchair. The fire was crackling. He opened a new page in his diary and wrote, "Sometimes the final reflection comes when we've already left the room. The crime was a symphony of silences, a choreography of omissions. Mott pushed, but someone else designed the scenario. Not all murderers kill with their hands. Some kill with their eyes, with art, with an invisible line at the edge of the canvas, and those are the hardest to see." He closed the notebook. This time, the case was really over. Afterward, the man who painted without a face. Days after its final discovery, in Solstice Manor, Hercule Poirot sat in his London study, surrounded by the muffled murmur of the city that filtered through the closed windows. Before him, on the oak table, lay 3 objects: Louis Ainsworth's diary, the portrait signed with the initials L.A., and a folder containing documents recently received from the Devon Registry Office. With the calm of someone dissecting a poisonous flower, Poirot read in a low voice, "Louis Ainsworth, born in 1880, illegitimate son of Lionel Ashcombe and a local maid. He is known to have briefly studied painting in Marseille before returning to England under an altered identity. His whereabouts are unknown since 1909. A ghost, indeed. A man who lived on the margins of the Ashcombe family, fueled by resentment and art. A painter who was never seen, but who achieved his final exhibition in the form of an almost imperceptible signature. Poirot leaned back in his chair. An invisible killer. A reflection in another reflection. The purest aspect of crime is what is left untouched. The next day, Poirot requested an audience with Inspector Howard of Scotland Yard. In the inspector's office, he handed over Ainsworth's notebook, the final piece of evidence. "You're not seeking legal revenge, are you, Poirot?" Howard asked after reading some passages. "No, because Ainsworth is gone. His body was never found, but the diary suggests his end." Poirot opened a page where Louis Ainsworth was writing. "Till the reflection is made, I will disappear like mist at dawn. I will leave no judgment. I will leave no shadow." "I think he took his own life," Poirot said with a sigh. "Perhaps on the coast, perhaps in the woods behind the manor. But the essential thing isn't his body. It's his work. Murder was his final signature." Howard closed the journal with a thoughtful gesture. "So, what should we do with this?" "File it," said Poirot, "but don't reveal it publicly. The whole truth won't protect the living. It will only tarnish the dead even more." Howard nodded. "Lady Eugenia?" "She doesn't need to know. She already lives with enough ghosts." A few days later, Poirot visited the gallery in Bloomsbury again. There, in a side room where not many visitors entered, hung the portrait of Anthony Langridge. It had been mounted without mention of the scandal, without a byline, just a date, and the title Poirot had personally requested. The reflection that wasn't him. He stared at the painting for a long time. A visitor, an old man, approached him. "Did you know the young man portrayed?" Poirot smiled kindly. "Let's just say I resolved your last message. It looks alive, right?" Poirot nodded. "Too much. Sometimes the dead still speak, only they do so in a low voice." That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot dined alone. A clear soup, toast, and a glass of lemon water. Nothing else. Then he sat down with his diary and wrote. This was a crime without visible blood. A murder of inheritances, of symbols, of unspoken words. Anthony Langridge died at Mott's hands, but also at the hands of an unacknowledged history. Louis Ainsworth was his silent executioner. He placed him in front of the mirror and left him there, trapped in an image that no one understood until it was too late. What is painted without a name sometimes screams louder than what is signed in ink. Poirot closed the diary with a solemn gesture. Then he turned on the radio. A Chopin nocturne was playing. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to close his eyes and rest. The case was over, not with an arrest, not with a shot, not with a public confession, but with an almost invisible line to... And that, for Poirot, was the most disturbing resolution of all. Addenda, the notebook of last words. A week after the formal closure of the case, and with the Bloomsbury Gallery receiving visitors intrigued by the now famous untitled portrait, a small package arrived at Hercule Poirot's apartment. It had no clear return address, only the initials BF stamped in blue ink on the back. The curious detective opened it with surgical precision. Inside, he found a hardcover notebook bound in brown leather. It was Basil Fleet's personal notebook. A note accompanied it. "Mr. Poirot, I leave this to you not as proof, but as testimony. I wanted to close it with words, but images abandoned me. This notebook contains my impressions, the days I lived at Solstice Manor, and what I think I saw through the cracks in the mirror. Perhaps you know what to do with all this." With respect, Basil F. Poirot placed the notebook on his desk, and after preparing a steaming cup of tea, began to read. The first pages were disorganized, as if Basil had written under the influence of anxiety rather than method. But as he progressed, the entries became more lucid, sharp, even artistic observations. Fragments like loose brushstrokes of a truth, as yet unformed. Day 2. Anthony told me his reflection changed when he was alone. I thought he was speaking metaphorically, but looking at the gallery mirror from a certain angle, I swore I saw a shadow that wasn't his own. Day 3. Griggs wiped something off the mirror frame and paused. He seemed nervous. When I approached, he walked away without a word. There was something under the frame, an engraving or symbol. I couldn't see it. Poirot made a mental note to check out the restored frame in the gallery. Day 4. During dinner, I noticed Worthing wasn't eating. He was looking at Anthony as if I'd already buried him. Mott, on the other hand, kept the conversation going, but he was still watching everyone's movements. Poirot continued, stopping at an almost illegible page written in smudged ink. There, Basil had drawn a face. Not precisely, but deliberately. A profile. Aquiline nose, angular chin. Not Anthony, not Worthing, not Mott, not himself. He was another man, an unrecognized face. Under the drawing, a single line. The real killer was never seen, only reflected. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. Later, that day, Poirot discreetly called the gallery. He asked to see the portrait's original frame, the one Basil had handed over, and which had later been replaced for preservation reasons. With an appointment scheduled for the following afternoon, Poirot went with his walking stick and a portable flashlight. In the restoration room, the frame was on a table, covered by a white cloth. Final annex, the mirror that still waits. Weeks passed without Poirot saying a single word about the case in his usual salon meetings or among his professional contacts. When asked about the matter of the portrait, he simply nodded with an ambiguous gesture, somewhere between satisfaction and fatigue. But inside him, the story hadn't ended with the last page, nor with Louis Ainsworth's diary, nor with Basil Fleet's notebook. There was something bothering him, not an inconsistency, not a mistake, but an absence, a figure, a gesture, an invisible actor. One evening in March, Poirot received a terse telegram from Brussels. It came from an antique bookshop. A batch of second-hand books, part of an anonymous donation, had been sorted, and one of them, a French edition of On the Psychology of the Gaze, a handwritten note in English had been found, the signature L.A. Poirot dressed immediately. He took his small suitcase. On the train to the continent, he leafed through his diary again. He kept returning to the same paragraph. Not all murderers kill with their hands. Some do it with the frame, with the void, with the gap they leave when they step out just before being seen. In Brussels, the bookstore The Hidden Eye, It was hidden in an alley between two cafes that no one frequented anymore. Poirot was greeted by a young archivist with thick glasses and a polite manner. "Monsieur Poirot, I've been expecting you. Here's the book." It was a copy with no market value. The pages were peeling. The ink was smeared. But there, between pages 42 and 43, written in a slanted, firm hand, was the note. "For the one who keeps looking. A crime never ends if its witness is not erased." He left, but the mirror hasn't completely broken. Maybe it's better this way. L.A. Poirot leaned back in the velvet armchair by the counter. The mirror isn't completely broken. What did Ainsworth mean? It wasn't a threat, nor a confession. It was a provocation. One more echo. Back in London, Poirot revisited the Bloomsbury Gallery. This time, he didn't ask to speak to the curators. He simply walked through the rooms until he reached the corner where the portrait hung. But it wasn't the same. It was a copy. "What happened to the original?" he asked the guard. "It was removed by order of the Central Archive, sir. Apparently, there was a structural fault in the old frame. Something about damp. They took it away for conservation, although I didn't see any of the regular conservators that day." Poirot paled. "And who authorized that?" "I don't know for sure. An elegant man. He wore gloves. He signed himself A. Lemoine. That name. Lemoine." Poirot had seen it before, on a fake passport found among Lionel Ashcombe's papers. A name used in at least 2 false identities associated with unacknowledged children. "Ainsworth, or someone like him," he murmured. "The mirror isn't completely broken, because someone is still holding it." That evening, Poirot received an envelope. No postmark, no signature. Inside, a postcard with a black and white image, the original portrait of Anthony. But this time, with a new detail. In the background, in the upper left corner, a second figure is reflected, a smiling face. With a paintbrush in hand, Poirot examined it for several long minutes. Then he placed it on the mantelpiece in front of the fire. He closed his eyes. Some cases never end. They recede like a velvet curtain, but the scene continues. And if you listen carefully, you hear footsteps, the echo of someone coming back in. This time, I won't close the mirror again. With his pen, Poirot wrote the last entry in his case diary. The killer was identified, the accomplice was revealed, the author continues painting, because there are crimes that are not an act, they are a signature that still writes. He closed the notebook, the lamp flickered, the night was clear. And somewhere, perhaps in another city, another mirror was waiting to be hung. Final chapter. The silence under the glass. For weeks, the image of the altered portrait, with the new face reflected in the upper corner, had haunted Hercule Poirot with the persistence of an incomplete melody. That unfamiliar face, smiling from a veiled distance, did not belong to Anthony Langridge or any of the identified suspects. It was the final spectre of a crime, whose symmetry, until then perfect, now held a dissonant note. Poirot knew that the crime was solved for the outside world. Mott had been prosecuted. Worthing had confessed his passive complicity. Lady Eugénie had withdrawn from the social scene, and the figure of Anthony Langridge had become a tragic warning. But for Poirot, the case still had one small window open, and it was that silently painted smile which no one had seen placed there. One afternoon, under the thick Thames fog, Poirot met Basil Fleet one last time. He invited him to a private room at the Athenaeum Club, and laid out on the table the photograph of the original portrait, signed by Louis Ainsworth, and the anonymous postcard with the new face. "Monsieur Fleet," Poirot began, "this picture wasn't painted by you, and yet it bears your frame. How is that possible?" Basil swallowed. "I never authorized the reproduction. After I handed over the original, I didn't know what they did with it, but I recognize that brushstroke. I've seen it before." "Where?" Basil leaned across the table. "On an old painting. During my studies in Marseille. There was a similar signature, L.A. I thought it was a coincidence, but the technique, the shadow without a line, the use of ochre as an undertone, it was identical." Poirot looked at him intensely. "And who showed you that painting?" "A restaurateur. He called himself Auguste Lemoine." Poirot leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let out a sigh. The circle had closed. Lemoine, the name used by the man who removed the portrait from the gallery, a pseudonym used by at least 3 generations of illegitimate Ashcombs. It was a signature inherited as much as the lineage. "So it wasn't just Ainsworth," Poirot murmured. "It was a legacy, a secret network of unacknowledged children, all raised on the margins, in the shadows. A hidden lineage that decided symbolically to sign the end of the tree from its most illegitimate reflection." The final revelation came in a letter weeks later. It was delivered by hand with no return address, in a pale grey envelope. Inside, a single page written in a fountain pen. "Mr. Poirot, the mirror is no longer necessary. Anthony was just one of many who grew up with a borrowed name and a stolen reflection. He tried to break it. I just helped hang it back up. The guilty parties, as you said, have already been judged. My part was different, to remind everyone that lineage never ends with blood. You were fair, therefore I leave the original to you. In an unnamed room you will find it. A.L. Poirot understood. At an old address in Devon, in the abandoned cottage that had belonged to Lionel Ashcombe before his marriage to Lady Eugénie, Poirot found the locked room. There, on a covered easel, was the portrait. But this time it wasn't Anthony's. It belonged to everyone. A group composition, unfinished but precise, where the faces of Worthing, Mott, Basil, Griggs, and even Lady Eugenia intertwined like layers against a background of broken mirrors. And in the centre, with his eyes closed and Lionel's ring shining discreetly on his finger, was A.L., Auguste Lemoine, Louis Ainsworth, or whoever signed the final act, not with blood, but with a brush. Poirot remained silent, and after many minutes he smiled. Barely. The crime was solved, but the story was painted. That night, back in London, Poirot closed the case diary with a red ribbon. On the last page he wrote, "Some murders are committed with poison, others with a knife. This was committed with a signature, and sealed with a smile." He turned off the lamp. The case was finally complete.